At my cousin's wedding, they laughed at me until my helicopter landed behind them. I never thought I would be betrayed by someone I loved, especially not in front of so many people. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was the way my sister Rebecca laughed along with them, her eyes sparkling with cruel delight as if my pain was the entertainment she'd been waiting for all evening. What I didn't realize then was how much deeper her betrayal went, how carefully orchestrated this moment had been. As I stood there in my carefully chosen dress, feeling invisible and worthless, I realized I had a choice. I could continue to let this define me, shrink into the shadows like I always had, or I could choose to change everything. The laughter echoing around me felt like it would never stop, but something inside me was already shifting, already planning. I didn't know how it would unfold, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. My name is Amelia, and I've always been the family's afterthought. You know the type, the quiet one who gets invited out of obligation, whose achievements get a polite nod while everyone else's get celebrated with champagne and tears of joy. I'd made peace with it, or so I thought, until my cousin Sarah's wedding day arrived and showed me just how cruel indifference could become. The venue was stunning, a sprawling garden estate with fairy lights strung between ancient oak trees and roses that seemed to bloom just for the occasion. Sarah had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and her wedding reflected that status perfectly. Everything was Instagram-worthy, including the guests who seemed to glide across the manicured lawn like they belonged in a magazine spread. I had spent weeks choosing my dress, a soft blue number that I thought made me look elegant and sophisticated. I'd even gotten my hair done professionally for the first time in years, splurging on a salon appointment that cost more than my usual monthly beauty budget. Looking back, I realized I was trying so hard to fit in, to finally be seen as someone worthy of belonging in this family. The ceremony was beautiful, and I genuinely felt happy for Sarah. She looked radiant, and her new husband gazed at her like she hung the moon. During the cocktail hour, I mingled awkwardly, making small talk with relatives who seemed to look through me rather than at me. But it was during the reception dinner that everything fell apart. The DJ called for a toast from the family, and one by one, relatives stood to share memories and well wishes. My uncle spoke about Sarah's childhood accomplishments. My aunt reminisced about family vacations where Sarah had been the life of the party. Then my sister Rebecca stood up, wine glass in hand, her smile too bright, too sharp. "I just want to say," Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the tent, "that Sarah has always been the standard we all aspire to. Unlike some of us," and here she glanced directly at me, "she's never needed to try so hard to be noticed." The words hit me like a physical blow. Laughter rippled through the crowd, not the warm kind you hear at weddings, but something colder, more pointed. I felt my cheeks burn as dozens of pairs of eyes turned toward me, some pitying, others amused. My carefully applied makeup suddenly felt like a mask, my beautiful dress like a costume I had no right to wear. Rebecca continued her toast, but I barely heard the words over the roaring in my ears. She was supposed to be my sister, my ally in this family, where I'd always felt like an outsider. Instead, she had just publicly confirmed what I'd always feared, that I was the joke, the one they all quietly pitied or, worse, found amusing in my desperate attempts to belong. The worst part was watching the faces around me. Some people looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one defended me. They just sat there, complicit in my humiliation, probably grateful it wasn't them in the spotlight. As Rebecca finished her toast and the crowd raised their glasses, I sat frozen in my chair, my own glass untouched. The fairy lights that had seemed magical earlier now felt harsh and exposing. The laughter and chatter around me became a blur of noise that made my head pound. That's when it hit me, the choice that would change everything. I could continue to sit here, accepting this treatment, letting them define who I was and what I was worth. Or I could finally, after years of being the family doormat, decide to write my own story. Will I choose to stay silent, or will I take control of my own story? Sitting there in that suffocating tent, Rebecca's words echoing in my mind, I realized this wasn't the first time I'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love me. The wedding humiliation was just the latest in a long line of cuts, each one seemingly small but collectively devastating. I thought about my 16th birthday party, the one Rebecca had convinced my parents to move to the same weekend as her college homecoming, so she could be there for me. Except she spent the entire party talking about her sorority sisters and college adventures, turning what should have been my celebration into another showcase for her fascinating life. When our relatives asked about my plans for college, Rebecca would jump in with stories about her own experiences, effectively erasing me from my own birthday conversation. Then there was my college graduation. I had worked 3 jobs to pay my way through school, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while Rebecca's education was funded entirely by our parents. The day I graduated summa cum laude, our family dinner conversation centered around Rebecca's new promotion at her marketing firm. My diploma sat unopened on the restaurant table while everyone toasted her latest achievement. When I tried to mention my acceptance into graduate school, my mother smiled absently and said, "That's nice, dear," before immediately asking Rebecca about her new apartment. The pattern was so consistent I'd started to believe it was natural, that this was simply how families worked. Rebecca was the sun, and the rest of us were planets orbiting around her brilliance. I'd convinced myself that my role was to be supportive, to celebrate others while expecting nothing in return. But the cruelest betrayal hadn't been public at all. 2 years ago, when I was going through the worst depression of my life after losing my job and my relationship in the same month, I had reached out to Rebecca. I'd called her crying, really crying for the first time since we were children. I told her I felt worthless, that I didn't know how to keep going. She listened for exactly 4 minutes before interrupting to tell me about a guy she was dating who might be the one. When I tried to bring the conversation back to my struggles, she sighed and said, "Amelia, you need to learn that dwelling on negative things just attracts more negativity. Maybe if you focused on being more positive, good things would happen to you." I'd hung up feeling worse than before I called. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Even my pain isn't important enough to matter." I'd never forgotten those words because they captured something I'd never been able to articulate before, that my feelings, my experiences, my very existence had been systematically minimized by the people who were supposed to care about me most. The wedding toast wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of being treated like an extra in other people's stories. Rebecca's public humiliation of me was just her putting a spotlight on what she'd been doing in private for decades. As I sat there watching the wedding guests dance and laugh, completely unaware of my internal earthquake, I realized that all those small betrayals had hollowed me out. I'd become a ghost of myself, so accustomed to being overlooked that I'd stopped expecting to be seen. I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, thinking that maybe if I took up less space, I'd be more lovable. But something was shifting inside me as I sat in that chair, my untouched wine growing warm in the humid evening air. All those years of swallowing my hurt, of making excuses for other people's cruelty, of convincing myself that I was being too sensitive, it was all rising to the surface like a tide I could no longer hold back. The worst part was realizing how thoroughly I'd been gaslit by my own family. They'd made me believe that their treatment of me was normal, even deserved. They'd trained me to accept crumbs and be grateful for them. Something crystallized in me as I sat there watching Rebecca pose for photos with the bride, her arm around Sarah's waist like they were the closest of friends. The way she threw her head back and laughed, completely unburdened by what she'd just done to me, was the final piece I needed to see the full picture of who my sister really was. I stood up from my table, my legs surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my hands. The evening air felt different on my skin, sharper, more alive. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt completely present in my own body. I wasn't going to sit there anymore, accepting whatever scraps of dignity they decided to throw my way. I wasn't going to smile and nod while they made jokes at my expense. I wasn't going to pretend that their treatment of me was normal or acceptable or something I deserved. Walking to the edge of the garden, away from the laughter and music, I pulled out my phone and did something I'd never done before. I started making a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a reckoning. Every slight, every dismissal, Every moment they'd made me feel like I was asking for too much by simply existing. Rebecca's toast tonight. The birthday party she hijacked. My graduation dinner, where I became invisible. The phone call, where she reduced my depression to a character flaw. The family vacation where they forgot to save me a seat at dinner. The Christmas morning, when my thoughtful gifts were met with polite thank yous, Rebecca's last-minute purchases were met with squeals of delight. As I typed, my anger transformed into something cleaner, more focused. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about reclaiming every moment they'd stolen from me, every time they'd made me question my worth, every instance where I'd swallowed my voice to keep the peace. I thought about the woman I'd been before I learned to make myself small. In high school, I'd been confident, funny, and ambitious. I'd had dreams that felt achievable and friendships that felt real. Somewhere along the way, my family had convinced me that version of myself was too much, too loud, too demanding. But that woman was still in there. I could feel her stirring, stretching after years of being cramped into a space too small for her spirit. Standing there in the garden, fairy lights twinkling above me like stars, I made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. I was done being the family's scapegoat. I was done accepting treatment that I would never give to another human being. I was done letting other people write my story. I had resources they didn't know about. I had achievements they'd never bothered to ask about. I had a life outside their narrow definition of who I was supposed to be. Over the years, while they'd been dismissing me, I'd been building something they couldn't see: financial independence, professional success, a network of people who actually valued what I brought to the table. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent so long being afraid of their disapproval that I'd forgotten I had the power to disapprove of them right back. Looking back at the wedding reception, I saw Rebecca holding court at a table full of cousins, probably sharing another story about my inadequacies. But for the first time, the sight didn't make me want to disappear. Instead, it made me want to show them exactly who they'd been underestimating all these years. I didn't go back to the reception that night. Instead, I drove home in silence, my mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating and planning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe twice in the 5 years I'd been with the company. I needed time to think, to plan, to become the architect of my own vindication. I made coffee and opened my laptop, pulling up files and documents I hadn't looked at in months. People see what they expect to see, and my family had always expected to see failure in me. They'd been so busy dismissing my achievements that they'd never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. To them, I was still the struggling girl who'd worked 3 jobs in college. They had no idea that girl had grown into a woman who'd built something remarkable. While Rebecca was climbing the corporate ladder at her marketing firm, celebrating each small promotion like it was a conquest, I'd been quietly revolutionizing sustainable technology development. The patents I'd filed, the consulting contracts I'd secured, the international recognition I'd received, none of it existed in their version of my story. 3 years ago, my biomaterials research had attracted the attention of a consortium of investors. The startup I'd co-founded was now valued at $27 million. Last month, I was invited to speak at a conference in Geneva. Next week, I will be flying to Tokyo to finalize a partnership that would change everything. But the crown jewel of my success was something I'd been keeping private, waiting for the right moment. The sustainable housing project I developed had just been approved for a major government contract. The signing ceremony was scheduled for next month, with media coverage and everything. It was the kind of success story that would make headlines in our small city. My plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would let them continue their narrative for exactly 1 more month. I would let Rebecca bask in her sense of superiority, let my parents continue treating me like their disappointing daughter, let the extended family whisper about my struggles. And then I would host a celebration they couldn't ignore. The venue I had in mind was perfect, the most exclusive private estate in the county, the same one where several celebrities had held their weddings. I'd rent it for an entire weekend, fly in a renowned chef from New York, hire the kind of live entertainment that would make Sarah's wedding look quaint. But the centerpiece would be the helicopter. I'd arrange for it to land right in the middle of the garden party, carrying the government officials who would be presenting me with a contract that would cement my reputation as one of the region's most innovative entrepreneurs. The guest list would include everyone who'd ever dismissed me, especially Rebecca. I'd invite the entire extended family, all of Sarah's wedding guests, everyone who'd been there to witness my humiliation. They'd receive elegant invitations with no explanation, just an address and a date. I spent the day reaching out to contacts, making calls, and sending emails. Every detail had to be perfect. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about showing them exactly how wrong they'd been, and for how long. The revenge would be served with champagne and canapes, delivered with a smile and wrapped in success so undeniable they'd never be able to diminish it again. The morning of my celebration dawned clear and crisp, the kind of October day that makes everything look like it's been painted in high definition. I stood on the terrace of the Whitmore estate, watching the catering staff arrange white linens and crystal glasses, and felt a strange calm settle over me. They'd all come. Every single person I'd invited had RSVP'd yes, their curiosity apparently too strong to resist. Rebecca had even called me the night before, her voice syrupy with fake concern. "Amelia, honey, what's this party for?" The invitation was so mysterious. "Are you sure you can afford the Whitmore estate? I don't want you to get in over your head." I'd simply told her she'd find out tomorrow and hung up, savoring the frustration in her voice. Now, as guests began arriving in their afternoon finery, I watched from the second-floor window. There was Rebecca, stunning as always in a designer dress, air-kissing relatives and friends. Sarah and her new husband had come, along with most of the wedding party. My parents arrived looking confused but pleased, probably assuming I'd finally done something worth celebrating, though they couldn't imagine what. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd all come to see my mysterious success story, the same people who'd never believed I had won. At exactly 3 o'clock, I descended the main staircase, wearing a midnight blue dress that had cost more than Rebecca's monthly salary. The conversations in the garden gradually quieted as people noticed me, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to barely concealed amusement. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice carrying easily across the garden. "I know you're wondering why you're here, and I promise you'll have your answer soon." I could see Rebecca whispering to my mother, probably making some comment about my delusions of grandeur. A few cousins were exchanging knowing looks, the kind that said, "Here goes Amelia again, trying too hard to be important." The next 20 minutes were exquisite torture. I made small talk, accepted compliments on the venue, and deflected questions about the occasion. I watched Rebecca work the crowd, subtly undermining me even here, at my own event. "Well, you know Amelia," I heard her say to Sarah's mother-in-law. "She's always had a flair for the dramatic. Remember when she tried to plan that surprise party in high school that nobody came to? That story wasn't even true, but it didn't matter. Rebecca was doing what she'd always done, rewriting my narrative to make herself look better." Then, at exactly 3:47 p.m., we heard it. The distinctive whir of helicopter blades cutting through the afternoon air. Conversation stopped. Heads turned skyward. The sound grew louder, more commanding, until it was impossible to ignore. The helicopter, a sleek black aircraft that looked like it belonged in a movie, descended slowly into the estate's main garden area, exactly as I'd planned. The downdraft sent napkins flying and forced everyone to step back, their carefully styled hair whipping around their faces. As the engine wound down, the passenger door opened, and out stepped 3 people in expensive suits: Senator Patricia Mills, the state's Director of Environmental Innovation, and the CEO of the largest sustainable development firm on the East Coast. I walked forward to greet them, my heels clicking confidently on the stone pathway. Behind me, I could hear the confused murmuring of my family, their questions overlapping in a cacophony of bewilderment. "Miss Chun," Senator Mills said, shaking my hand warmly, "congratulations on this historic achievement. This partnership represents the future of sustainable development." The CEO stepped forward with a leather portfolio. The government contract we're announcing today will fund the construction of 50 sustainable housing communities using your revolutionary biomaterials technology. It's the largest contract of its kind in state history. As photographers emerged from the helicopter to document the signing, I turned to face my family. Their expressions were a study in shock, confusion, and dawning realization. Rebecca's face had gone completely white. My mother's mouth was literally hanging open. My father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the crowd, "I'd like you to meet the officials who are here to finalize my company's $38 million contract with the state government." Chun Innovations has just become the primary contractor for the largest sustainable housing initiative in our state's history. The contract signing took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of cameras flashing, officials speaking about innovation and environmental leadership, and my family standing frozen in various states of shock. I smiled and shook hands and said all the right things, but inside, something felt off. This should have been my moment of triumph. I should have felt vindicated, powerful, complete. Instead, as the helicopter lifted off and the officials departed, I found myself watching Rebecca's face and feeling empty. She looked devastated. Not just surprised or embarrassed, but genuinely shattered. The confident woman who had humiliated me at the wedding was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and small. My parents approached me tentatively, as if I were a stranger they weren't sure they were allowed to know. "Amelia," my mother said, her voice trembling, "why didn't you tell us? All this time we thought." "You thought what?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "You thought I was still the failure you decided I was years ago." The hurt in her eyes was immediate and raw. "We never thought you were a failure. We didn't know." But that was the problem, wasn't it? They didn't know because they'd never asked. They'd been so comfortable with their version of me that they'd never bothered to wonder if it was accurate. As the afternoon wore on, relatives approached me with congratulations that felt hollow, their eyes bright with the kind of attention I'd craved my entire life. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me, to hear about my company, to be associated with my success. The same people who had ignored me for decades were now hanging on my every word. Rebecca kept her distance, nursing a glass of wine at the far end of the garden. I caught her looking at me several times, her expression unreadable. When our eyes met, she would quickly look away, like she couldn't bear to hold my gaze. Around 5 o'clock, she finally approached me. Her usual confidence was completely absent, replaced by something I'd never seen in her before: humility. "Amelia," she said quietly, "I need to apologize. Not just for the wedding, but for everything. I had no idea what you'd accomplished. I'm proud of you." The words should have felt like victory. Instead, they left me feeling hollow. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? Recognition. Respect. An apology from the sister who had spent years making me feel worthless. But standing there, watching Rebecca struggle to find words, I realized something that shook me to my core. My success felt diminished when it was only valued after it became impossible to ignore. These people's opinions had held so much power over me, but now that I had their admiration, I discovered I didn't want it anymore. The validation I'd been seeking my entire life felt meaningless when it came from people who had never truly seen me, who only cared about me now because external forces had deemed me worthy of their attention. Later that evening, after the last guests had left and the catering staff had cleaned up, I sat alone on the estate's terrace, still in my midnight blue dress. The fairy lights strung through the trees reminded me of Sarah's wedding, but the emotion they evoked was completely different now. I had proven them all wrong. I had shown them exactly who they'd been underestimating. I had orchestrated the perfect revenge, complete with dramatic flair and undeniable evidence of my worth. So why did I feel so empty? Maybe it was because revenge, no matter how satisfying in theory, couldn't undo the years of damage that had been done. It couldn't give me back the confidence they'd chipped away at or restore the self-worth they'd gradually eroded. It couldn't heal the wounds that had formed the foundation of who I'd become. 3 weeks after the helicopter landing that changed everything, I found myself in an unexpected place: therapy. Not because the revenge had broken me, but because the emptiness afterward had shown me something I wasn't ready to face on my own. Dr. Sarah Martinez listened without judgment as I recounted the wedding humiliation, the years of dismissal, and the elaborate vindication I'd orchestrated. When I finished, she asked a simple question that unraveled everything I thought I knew about what had happened. Amelia, who were you trying to prove your worth to, them or yourself? The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent so much energy focusing on their perception of me that I'd never stopped to examine my own. Even in my moment of triumph, I'd been looking to them for validation, waiting for their recognition to make my success feel real. I said slowly, I've been waiting my whole life for someone else to tell me I'm enough. Dr. Martinez nodded. And how did it feel when they finally did? Empty, I admitted. Like it was too late, or like it didn't count because I had to force it. That session opened a floodgate of realizations. I began to understand that my family's treatment of me had trained me to seek external validation for my self-worth. Even my professional success, as genuine and impressive as it was, had partly been driven by a desperate need to prove I wasn't the failure they'd made me feel like. But here's what they never understood, and what I was finally beginning to see. Their opinion of me had never been based on who I actually was. It was based on their own insecurities, their need to have someone to look down on, their investment in maintaining a family hierarchy that served their egos. Rebecca's cruelty hadn't been about my inadequacy. It had been about her fear that I might actually be more capable than she was. My parents' dismissal hadn't been about my achievements being unworthy. It had been about their inability to see beyond the roles they'd assigned us in childhood. Over the following weeks, I started making different choices. Instead of avoiding family gatherings, I began attending them with a new perspective. I didn't go to prove anything or to collect the admiration I'd finally earned. I went because I wanted to, and I left when I didn't. When Rebecca tried to engage me in the old dynamic, either the dismissive version or the new overly deferential one, I simply refused to participate. When she attempted to diminish one of our cousins at Thanksgiving dinner, I spoke up calmly and directly. Rebecca, that's not true, and it's not kind. Sarah's job is important to her, and that's what matters. The shocked silence that followed was profound, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people realizing that the old rules no longer applied. My parents began reaching out more frequently, clearly trying to rebuild a relationship they were finally recognizing they'd damaged. At first, I was skeptical, waiting for them to revert to their old patterns. But gradually, I realized their efforts were genuine, even if clumsy. The most important shift happened inside me, though. I stopped checking my phone compulsively for validation from colleagues. I stopped measuring my day's worth by other people's reactions to my achievements. I started trusting my own assessment of my work, my choices, my life. I also started sharing my success in ways that felt genuine rather than defensive. I accepted speaking engagements not to prove my worth, but because I had knowledge worth sharing. I mentored young entrepreneurs not to showcase my expertise, but because I remembered what it felt like to doubt yourself, and I wanted to help others avoid that pain. The most surprising development was with Rebecca. Once I stopped seeking her approval or fearing her disapproval, our relationship began to change. She couldn't manipulate what I no longer needed from her. When she tried to apologize again, more elaborately this time, I stopped her. Rebecca, I appreciate that you want to make amends, but what I need isn't an apology. What I need is for us to build a new relationship based on who we actually are now, not who we were or who we thought each other was. It was a conversation we were still having and might always be having. But for the first time, it felt like we were talking as equals. 6 months later, I stood in the garden of my new home, a beautiful craftsman house with wide windows and a wraparound porch that I'd bought for myself, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply because I loved it. The morning sun streamed through the oak trees, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with who I was. The sustainable housing project was exceeding all expectations. 3 communities were already under construction, and families were moving into homes that would change their lives. But the success felt different now. It was mine to enjoy without the desperate need for external validation that had once driven me. Rebecca, and I had coffee every few weeks now, carefully building something new from the ashes of our old relationship. She was learning to see me as I actually was, and I was learning to forgive the sister who had been shaped by the same dysfunctional family dynamics that had wounded me. Our conversations were tentative but real, marked by an honesty we never shared before. My parents had begun asking about my work with genuine curiosity, and while I was cautious, I could see they were trying to understand the daughter they'd never bothered to know. The relationships weren't perfect, but they were authentic in a way they'd never been before. The most profound change, though, was in how I moved through the world. I no longer entered rooms wondering if I belonged there. I no longer measured my words to avoid taking up too much space. I no longer apologize for my success or downplay my achievements to make others comfortable. Last week, I spoke at a conference for young women entrepreneurs. Afterward, a 20-something woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I've been trying to earn my family's approval my whole life, and listening to you made me realize I don't need their permission to value myself." In that moment, I understood that my journey, the pain, the revenge, the healing, had led me to something far more valuable than personal vindication. It had given me the ability to help others recognize their own worth before they spent decades seeking it in all the wrong places. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I reflected on the woman who had sat frozen at Sarah's wedding, absorbing her sister's cruelty and believing she deserved it. She felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer identified with. The helicopter had been dramatic, yes, but it was never really about the helicopter. It was about the moment I decided to stop letting other people define my value. It was about choosing to write my own story instead of accepting the one they'd written for me. I pulled out my phone and deleted the list I'd made that night in the garden, the inventory of hurts and slights I'd been carrying like stones in my pockets. I didn't need it anymore. The past was just that, past. It had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. The future stretched ahead, not as a series of obstacles to overcome or people to prove wrong, but as an open canvas where I could create whatever felt true and meaningful to me. For the first time in my life, I was enough, not because someone else had finally recognized it, but because I knew it in my bones, unshakable and sure. The little girl who had learned to make herself small was finally free to take up all the space she'd been meant to occupy. And the space was beautiful,